To get us started. Good morning, all. Hope you are plodding through the final. Today we have James Campbell, a fellow master gardener, to talk about bees and the fascinating world of pollinators. In today's guest co-trainer spot, we have Patrick Walsh. Yay! Patrick, can you share what you are working on at Marin Master Gardeners?
Sure. I am mainly working on the pruning guild lately. We had quite a few rainouts this winter, so it has been a pretty busy March where we met just about every Wednesday for make updates. That's not usually how we meet, but it was quite a lot of pruning over the past couple of weeks, and it's been fun.
Hey, slide number 2, please. And that's you.
All right. Today we're talking about protecting pollinators as part of the wildlife habitat and environment element of earth-friendly gardening. Providing pollinators with the food they need allows them to perform the important job of pollinating our plants, flowers, fruits, and vegetables. Protecting their habitat is an essential part of our earth-friendly gardening program.
Hey, I am James. Are you here today?
I'm here.
Okie dokie. Just wanted to make sure of that before I went on. What we have planned today is Bees by James Campbell, and I'm so excited you're here. Certification and VMS review, MMG projects overview, final exam, there's some housekeeping to be done, graduation planning, and closing the garden gate. And if anyone has questions afterwards, please tell me about that. Joanna Ami has asked for some time at the end of the class with just the trainees. So Melissa and I will sign off after closing the garden gate. Joanna, before I sign off, I want to make sure that people do not have any questions about today's presentation or what's happening next week, and then I will sign off. And then I would like to introduce James Campbell. James Campbell has been a master gardener since 2010. He began his adventures in beekeeping before that in 2008. He has been involved in a number of projects and now co-chairs Harvey's Garden at Blackie's Pasture in Tiburon, and is editor of Marin's Master Gardener column for Marin IJ. Did I leave anything out, James, that you want to add?
Thank you for the introduction. No, that's pretty good.
Okay, thank you. You're on.
Great. So I think I want to share my screen quickly. Desktop. Share. Let me see if I can. Sorry, I don't do this that often, so let me.
I hear you, James.
Yeah,
whatever you need, whatever.
I noticed a lot of the actual thing I was looking for was blocked. So let me get started here. All right, does everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. I know you're towards the end of your training class, and I just wanted to say, I'm sure you, like myself, really appreciated all the efforts of the trainers. It's a really big lift to get us to this point, and so thank you for inviting me.
Of the Zoom meeting, so
can we please mute ourselves?
Thank you. So of course today we're going to be talking about bees, and I want to talk about bees because of the vital role they play in maintaining a healthy ecosystem and ensuring our food supply. Probably you've heard these statistics a lot, but 80% of the flowering plants in the world are pollinated by bees. We have other pollinators like birds and butterflies, but a full 80% are pollinated by bees. And 75% of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables grown here in the United States are pollinated by bees. When we say bees, probably the first thing that comes to a lot of people's mind are honeybees. But I think it's really important to recognize the role that our native solitary bees and our bumblebees play in the pollination process. If you think about it, European honeybees didn't arrive into the United States until the Europeans came. So think about some of our native fruits and vegetables like squash and beans, pawpaws, blueberries, cranberries. Those were all pollinated by native solitary bees before the European honeybees were introduced to our country. So there's a couple different ways that we can classify bees. You know, some of the ways we do it is by their lifestyle. We also can classify them by their pollen foraging habits. I just threw this slide up here because maybe people don't realize that solitary bees are in fact the majority in California. A full 75% of our bee population are solitary bees. So what are solitary bees? Well, a solitary bee is a very distinctive group within the bee family. They have a single female who typically lives in and builds her nest by herself. So she will go out and she will build a nest. She'll provision it with something called bee bread, which is a combination of pollen and nectar. And then she'll lay between 1 and 20 eggs. And then her job is kind of done. And the bees go through their lifestyle stages and then they become adults. Many solitary bees, before they become adults, enter a kind of state of suspended animation, which is called diapause. And in diapause, they're basically, you know, suspended in time. It allows them to survive dry weather and, you know, inclement weather, and it allows them to sort of just rest and be hibernated until their pollinating favored plants come out. Remarkably, some diapause periods with bees can last up to 10 years. So a solitary bee's lifestyle will take place within a single year, but that lifestyle can last a couple weeks to a couple months. It really varies depending on the solitary bee species we're talking about. And what happens is they tend to emerge when their favored pollinating plants are in flower. So that means solitary bees can be emerging throughout the season. So again, just to reiterate, a solitary bee female will emerge in the spring, build her nest, lay her eggs, and then she'll pass away. And when she emerges in the spring from her birth nest, the male bee will also emerge at that same time. He will typically wait at the nest entrance to fertilize the bee. They'll do it once or twice, and then his job is done. He will pass away, and the queen goes about bringing in the next generation. Okay, social bees are quite different because social bees form colonies and nests with multiple generations. These can have, I'm not sure if everyone's getting that feedback, and I'm not sure why that's happening. I guess it stopped. So they can have perennial life cycles or multi-year life cycles. So we're going to just go through a couple different, sorry, let me go back because I wanted to, oops, what have I done? Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about how a bumblebee life cycle works. Like solitary bees, a bumblebee's life cycle will take place within a year. Typically, the bumblebees, queens, will emerge in the late summer or early fall. She'll emerge with her nestmate males. They will mate, then the male will die. The bumblebee female queen will then go out and kind of build up her reserves, and then she'll go into hibernation. She'll emerge again either in the spring or early summer, and she will go and find a nest site. She will build that nest site. She'll provision it for the first generation, and she'll rear her first generation of kids. But then those female bees that she's raised will become worker bees. And so for the subsequent generations, the queen will just stay in her nest while the worker bees do all of the foraging and provisioning for the nest and taking care of the young. Towards the late summer, the bumblebee queen will then shift into producing reproductive offspring. So she'll produce some males and some future queens. And then the whole process begins again. She'll pass away, and the new queens and the new drone males will emerge. They'll mate, and the whole process starts again. So honeybees are a little bit different because they have different castes in a honeybee hive. And based on their birthright, they live for different periods of time and have different roles within the community. So the largest bee is typically the male drone. He will be about 24 days in gestation. And so honeybees, just like all bees and all insects, go through 4 stages of development. They start out as eggs, and then they become pupa, and then larvae, and then adults. So for the drone male, that'll take about 24 days. And his lifespan's typically about 8 weeks long. And his sole role is to reproduce with virgin queens. So they'll hang around the nest. If they're needed, they'll mate, but often they never get the chance to do that. And when winter rolls around, when they become kind of a burden, even if they're still in their lifespan of 8 weeks, the bees will kick them out and tell them, we're done with you. The majority of bees in a honeybee hive are what we call worker bees. And worker bees are female unfertilized bees that come from fertilized eggs. The drone males come from unfertilized eggs. So these unfertilized female bees come from fertilized eggs, and they'll have a bunch of different roles in their lifespan. They can be cleaner bees, guard bees, they can be nurse bees, they'll go out and forage. They often have many roles, with foraging typically being the last role in their life cycle because it's the most dangerous. In the summer and spring time, when it's the most active time for a honeybee hive, worker bees can live between 2 and 5 weeks. And then as winter starts to roll around, they can live up to 45 weeks. But their primary job at that time is to keep the queen warm and comfortable. So they don't really leave the hive that much. They just live off the stored honey, and they kind of just create heat for the queen to survive through the winter. Queens have a very different story. They can take about 16 days to come to full development. The worker bee takes about 21 days. And then the queen basically leaves the hive once in her lifetime as a virgin, and she'll mate 1 or 2 or 3 times while she's out. And then she'll come back to the hive, and that's where she'll spend the rest of her lifetime. That can be anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And her primary job will be laying eggs. She's larger than is recognizable because she's larger and a bit heavier than the worker bees. If a queen bee starts to get old or ill and is not producing enough eggs, the worker bees can do something called supersedure, which is when they produce new queen cells to replace that queen. Another way that they pass the torch is, sometimes you've heard of a bee swarm, and that's when typically a bee queen will leave with a subset of the worker bees and try to go off and start her own colony. In a healthy beehive in the summertime, in the spring and summer, you'll have between 50 and 60,000 bees. And then in the wintertime, that number is culled down to about 20,000. And as I mentioned, those 20,000 will basically just be there to keep the queen warm and keep her alive throughout the winter. As I mentioned at the top, aside from classifying bees by their life cycle lifestyle, we also classify them by their pollen foraging habits. And there's two main groups within this pollen foraging behavior. One are what we call the pollen specialist bees, and the other are the pollen generalist bees. So pollen specialist bees, also more scientifically called oligolectic bees, are bees that have evolved or co-evolved with certain species of flowering plants to forage from those plants. Within this pollen specialist subgroup, you can find an even rarer type of bee, which is called a monolectic bee. And that bee has evolved to forage from only one kind of flowering plant. So not a whole species of plants, but just from one specific plant. Generalist bees, as you can probably gather from their name, are able to forage pollen from a wide variety of plants. So here we're going to just look a little bit more closely at some specialist or oligolectic bees. The squash or gourd bee have about 20 different varieties. And the way they've co-evolved to be specific pollinators of squash and gourd species of plants is that they have two interesting adaptations. One is that they have these scopal hairs, and you'll hear me talk about the scopal hairs. These are hairs on their back legs that are kind of sticky. Sometimes they're branched, so frizzy hairs that are used to carry pollen. They gather the pollen on those legs to bring it back to their hives. With the squash bees, the scopal hairs on the back of their legs are in fact unbranched, so they're not fuzzy, and they're not very densely growing. They're kind of have wide spaces. And the reason for this is that squash and gourd pollen is some of the largest pollen grains there are. So I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to try with a Q-tip to pollinate your squash plants, but you'll see squash and gourd pollen is very large. The other adaptation of these 20 different squash and gourd bees is they have very large ocelli. And ocelli are, all bees have two sets of eyes. They have compound eyes and ocelli. The compound eyes are the ones you see on the side of their head, and that kind of forms pictures for them. But the ocelli are three little eyes that are on the top of their head that mostly play a role in discerning light differences that helps them fly and do things like that. With the squash and gourd bees, the ocelli are very large on the top of the head, and that helps them with a very peculiar to their species habit of pollinating, foraging at dusk. So squash blossoms are at their peak very early in the morning before a lot of bees would be coming out. And so these squash and gourd bees are able to navigate in that low light because of these very large ocelli. Okay, so generalist bees are, like I mentioned, able to pollinate from a wide variety of flowering plants. But even though they can go to many different kinds of plants for their pollen and nectar, they practice something called flower constancy. And what this means is that they will only go to one type of flower. So even though they're surrounded by a lot of flowers that they would be able to collect pollen or sip nectar from, they'll only go to one type of flower. And so this flower constancy can happen on different time scales. It might be that just during one foraging trip, the bee will go to one type of flower. It could be that they choose just one type of flower for the whole day, or they could choose one type of flower for their whole lifetime. They're not certain why this happens, but obviously it makes sense because pollination wouldn't happen if a bee went from a pear tree to lupine, for example, because it would be a different kind of pollen and pollination wouldn't occur. But they think it has something to do with the short-term memory of the bee and its ability to remember flower structures. So So as we've just been looking at, bees have evolved in specific ways to help them with pollinating plants. But interestingly, flowers have also evolved in ways to make sure that the pollinators have a good and fruitful experience when they visit a flower. So one of the things that flowers have evolved with are something called honey or nectar guides. And these honey or nectar guides are analogous to the markings on a runway at an airport. They basically tell a bee where to land and where to go in order to collect its nectar reward. So just a little back information. Bees use pollen primarily, their protein source, as young bees. They feed it to their brood to get them to full adult size. Once they're adult size, they basically only eat or drink nectar, and that provides them all their needs for energy and their metabolic system. So when a bee lands on a flower, it can be going just to get nectar. It could be going to collect pollen to bring back to the hive. It can be going for both. And so these nectar and honey guides often direct a bee to the nectarines or nectaries. There's two different names for these nectar glands. And it'll always make sure that the bee passes by the reproductive part of the flower so that pollination can happen. So here we have two flowers that you can see very clearly these markings, and those are the honey or nectar guides. But most flowers were not really able to see the honey or nectar guides because bees see a different part of the color spectrum than we do. So humans have 3 receptors. We see green, blue, and red. And bees have also 3 receptors, but they see blue, green, and ultraviolet, which we can't see. So here, a scientist has taken photographs of some flowers to reflect the UV markings on there so we can see what a bee might see when it sees a flower. So this is a Fremontodendron. It's not the same flower, obviously. I took one of the pictures, but this scientist, Kirsten Pearsons, took the other, and you can see these UV markings that are telling the bee where to go to get to the nectar glands. Again, this is a mimulus, which again was taken to show the UV markings. This is the monkey flower. And aside from the fact that having these honey and nectar guides provides an efficient pollination experience for the bees, it also has overwhelmingly led to the prevention of something called nectar robbing. So if you can imagine, all flowers have these nectar glands or nectaries or nectarines, as they're called, in different places on the flower, according to the floral structure. So a bee can't kind of keep track of that. So the honey and nectar guides tell them where to go. But if a bee, just can't be bothered, what it will often do is just kind of drill a hole below the flower and just suck the nectar from the bottom. And of course, this is bad for the flower because they don't go by the sexual organs of the flower, and so no pollination happens. Another interesting flower adaptation that occurs to help the pollinator visitors is something called papillate conical cells. They're not visible to our eyes, but they usually are on flower petals. And they're these little conical cells that develop that basically just help a bee have a surface to land on and like stick the landing, kind of like Velcro. If it were smooth and the flower was hanging upside down or moving in the wind, they would kind of not have a good footing. So these papillate conical cells give them that good footing. And so there's 2 interesting experiments that showed the purpose of these cells. One was an observation of bumblebees in a field of snapdragons. And in this field of snapdragons, many of the plants were mutants that had no papillate conical cells. And by observation, they saw that those plants were, by and large, avoided by the bumblebees, who would only visit the snapdragons that had the papillate conical cells. Another interesting experiment is the one that of the Macronesian lotus, who lost its native pollinator, and the pollination started being taken over by birds, replacing the bees, and the flowers stopped producing the papillae conical cells. So once the pollinator changed from insects to birds, the flowers stopped expending the energy to create these papillae conical cells. So it's a great illustration of the interplay between flowers and their pollinators, with these kind of floral traits adapting to the specific needs of the pollinator species. So let's talk a little bit about pollination. Pollination occurs when pollen grains from the male reproductive organs are transferred to the female organs of the same species. So this process results in the fertilization of the plant ovaries, which then leads to the formation of seeds. Pollination can take place in two ways. One could be cross-pollination, where pollen is transferred between plants from one plant to a very different plant. Or it could be self-pollination, where the pollen from the same plant is introduced to the stigma of the same flower. Bees are great pollinators because of their pollen collecting habits. And what happens is when a bee lands on a flower, it has an electrostatic charge that we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later. But that static charge basically makes the bee a magnet for the pollen. So the pollen will adhere to the bee, and as it's going about doing its business and visiting the nectar glands, that pollen will brush off on the sticky stigma, and that's where pollination happens. The bees are conscious that they're covered in pollen, and so with the some bees have this scopal hairs I talked about on their back legs, so they'll groom themselves and gather as much of that pollen into their scopal hairs as possible. But honeybees actually have evolved to have a pollen basket or a corbucula on their back legs. So you can, if you've ever observed a beehive, you can see on the back legs the different colored pollen they're coming in and out with, because they have these baskets that they've evolved with. So as I promised, I'm going to talk a little bit more about electrostatic energy and bees and flowers. So when a bee is flying through the air, it's losing electrons and building up a strong positive charge. And we all probably know how this works, because if you've ever rubbed a balloon on your head, you've done the same. You've been, losing electrons and creating a charge on the balloon, and that's why it can stick to a wall. Or make your hair rise. So when the bees are flying through the air, they're building up this positive charge, and then they land on these flowers, which have a very weak negative charge because they're grounded. And what happens, as I mentioned before, is that as they land on the flower, it's like two magnets. The negatively charged pollen will be attracted to the positively charged bee because it's a really strong, much stronger charge. And the pollen almost jumps onto the bee. But as the bee is doing its business of visiting the flower and going to get some nectar, the weakly negatively charged flower will take on and transition to a little bit of a positive charge. So what happens is that once that bee leaves that flower and it has a little bit of a positive charge, if another bee comes along, who has a positive charge, it'll recognize that the flower has that positive charge because it'll feel pushed away from that flower. So it won't waste its time visiting a flower who have empty nectar glands or have just had a lot of pollen taken off of it. And remember, if you played with magnets as a kid, if you had a positive and negative magnet, they would be drawn to each other. But if you had two similarly charged magnets, they would kind of push away from each other. And this change in the flower's charge is just a short thing, but just enough time for the nectar glands to refill. Another interesting thing about how bees kind of know whether a flower has been visited or not is they can use their olfactory senses. Bumblebees in particular have stinky feet, And when they visit a flower, they leave a smell on the flower that lets you know, another bee visitor know that, you know, this flower is probably tapped out right now. So we talked a little bit about the main kind of pollination, but there is another kind of pollination called buzz pollination. And buzz pollination happens for about 9% of the world's flowers, including this list here: tomatoes, potatoes, cranberries, blueberries, eggplant, manzanita. And what's different about buzz pollination is that on the anther of the flower, instead of the pollen being outside and, you know, easily accessible, it's actually encapsulated on the anthers of these particular plants. And then these anthers have a little hole at the end, kind of like a pepper shaker. And so what happens is that the only way to release that pollen is through a specific vibration. So buzz pollination happens when a bee will attach itself to a anther, an enclosed anther, and it'll detach its wing muscles from its wings, but then it'll engage them as if it's going into flight. And this starts a vibration that will vibrate the anther perfectly to release pollen. And this is a protective mechanism on the flower's part, and the pollen's precious to that one, so it doesn't just want anybody coming along and taking it. And so another interesting thing is that you can mimic that vibration with a tuning fork, and you can put it next to an anther, and it's the middle C vibration that'll cause it to release its pollen. So speaking of pollen, pollen is, as you can see from this photograph, it's not all the same. We call it pollen, and maybe we think it's the same, but it's actually very different colors, different sizes, and has about 200 different substances in varying amounts and degrees that actually makes pollen very different from plant to plant. So pollen is made up of amino acids, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, fatty acids, phenolic compounds, enzymes, coenzymes, vitamins, and various bioelements. And it's all in different combinations, so not all pollen is created the same. And a very interesting study in Switzerland, the scientist Claude Savedny did an experiment, and he took 2 different types of mason bees. And mason bees are solitary bees, as we learned, is one of their classifications, but they're also generalist bees. So that means they can forage from a lot of different plants. But Savedny wanted to see what would happen if these 2 mason bee species, who are closely related, were fed just one type of pollen. Like, what happens if you feed just one type of pollen to a generalist bee? And he had a really interesting result, because he used 4 different plant types. And with some of the plant types, the mason bee was able to raise its brood no problem. But the related mason bee found it lethal for the brood. It killed their brood. The same pollen which was successful for the one mason bee species was lethal to the other. And vice versa. That happened, that there was another type of pollen that was fine for the originally dying mason bee population, but it worked for them, and then it was lethal for the ones who had thrived on the other type of pollen. So what it turns out is that there might be something to the composition of the pollen that makes it attractive and supporting to specific bees. So they haven't done a lot of work around this, but perhaps part of the flower constancy question also has to do with the nutrients that bees get from specific pollen from specific plants. Anyway, the thing to remember is not all pollen is created the same. So nectar is a sugary fluid that's secreted by plants in the specialized glands, the nectar glands, that are called nectarines or nectaries. It's the main energy source for bees. And as I mentioned, they do use pollen to grow to full size as their protein source. But once they're fully grown, nectar is the primary source of nutrition for them. And it gives them all they need, the energy for flight and foraging and all their work in their nests and hives and all their other metabolic activities. Again, nectar can be robbed from a flower. Sometimes and here is actually a bee who has too short a proboscis to go into this flower. And so it can't really reach the nectar glands. So it just is busting in and doing what they call nectar robbing. But nectar robbing does not facilitate pollination. So that is a problem for the flower. So nectar is not only sustains bees, but it also is the raw material for making honey. Most honey is really made by honeybees. Some stingless bees and certain bumblebee species can make small amounts of honey, but really when we're talking about honey, we're talking about honeybees. And so the way this works is that a honeybee has two different stomachs. It has the stomach that's tied into the rest of its digestive system. And then it has another one that's called a honey stomach or a honey crop. And this one works only for the transportation of nectar. So the bee will fill its crop with nectar and it'll go back to the hive. It'll then regurgitate that stomach contents to another worker bee. And what happens in this honey crop stomach is that there are certain enzymes in there that will change the pH of the nectar. And it'll also break the sucrose sugars down into fructose and glucose. So it changes the pH, it changes the sugar structure of the nectar. And through this process of regurgitation and moving it into the hive, they basically decrease the water content in the nectar. So about 16 or 17% of the water is removed. And so then the honey will be placed in these cells, as you can see in the photograph here. And then it won't be sealed until the honey is fully cured. And once it's fully cured, it'll be capped and it can be used as a future energy source for the honeybees. All right, so we talked a little bit about the bees and the pollination process and the different ways we classify bees. And now I want to tell you guys a little bit about how we can bring bee pollinators into our own gardens. And most of this information I'm getting is from the work of Professor Gordon Franke, who's a UC Berkeley professor who has a couple books out. He also runs this large bee garden in Berkeley in the Oxford Track area. And they do different experiments at this garden, and they also make different observations, and they're trying to sort of figure out, how bees can survive in our area, in urban environments. It's a great website. It's called the Urban Bee Lab. And if you go onto the website, you'll learn a lot about the bees in the Bay Area. You'll learn a lot about the most popular pollinator attractive plants for our area. It's a great resource. But I'm going to give you a couple fundamental principles that they've learned from the Bee Lab. One of them is to plant large patches of a single flower type. So planting large patches of a single flower type is really the optimal design for attracting bees, butterflies, and other pollinators. It's got to be at least 1 meter or 3 feet in diameter. And it basically replicates the patterns you see in nature. If you've ever gone out hiking or you go to look at wildflowers, they're in large patches typically. And this works really well for pollinators because they're able, as we know through flower constancy, to visit one type of flower all in one place, so they don't expend a lot of energy to get all the pollen and nectar they need from a single type of flower. In fact, what they noticed at the Urban Bee Lab or the Oxford Track Garden is that even in the same garden, in the same place, with the same flower, that if it was planted in smaller patches than the big, 3-foot diameter or wider patches, it was less visited by pollinators. So there's a pretty good evidence that the big patches are the more attractive ones to the bees and other pollinators. So the other important takeaway is that you need to have diversity in the garden. Diversity means, you know, anywhere between 15 and 20 different species of flowering plants, even in a kind of compact garden. By ensuring a consistent supply of blooms, particularly during the season, which is the late spring and early summer, that's when bee diversity is at its peak. You will maximize how attractive your garden is to bee pollinators. Of course, California natives are great choices. They flower in the early spring and summer, and that's really good for our native solitary bees. But of course, the longer you can have bloom in your garden, the better. And so even bringing in some ornamentals from, you know, other places that can be in bloom from the late summer to the fall is very attractive to bee pollinators. As we mentioned, a full 75% of the bees in California are the solitary bees, and the majority of them do nest in the ground. So another takeaway from the Urban Bee Lab is that we need to leave some parts of our garden uncovered. This means no weed cloth, no pavement, no gravel, no thick layer of mulch. If they can't find a place to build nests, you're going to have fewer bees in your garden because they just, you know, don't want to travel too far to get their food. So it's a great idea to leave some space under bushes or around trees where you're really not supposed to have mulch right up to the base of a tree, under hedges. There's a lot of places that you can leave open ground for bees to nest. Another good idea is these little bee condominiums, or the little, you see they're for the, you know, bees not only nest in the ground, but they nest in hollow spaces. So it can be in grasses, or you see often these combinations of bamboo. You can place those in your garden as well to provide a place for those hollow nesters. And then lastly, they want to have some source of water in your garden. Honeybees are really the only bee that can transport water back to the hive, again, using their honey stomach. So most bees need a water source. This can be a shallow dish. It can be a puddle, you know, under where your hose bib is. It can just be some wet earth they can get water from. Any different way that you can kind of provide water will be helpful to pollinators. So now the sad part of the story. We're going to talk about bee diseases, and microbial pathogens include viruses, bacteria, and fungi, and they pose significant threats to bee populations. The severity of the infections by these microbial agents is really influenced by a variety of factors. Exposures to other stressors like pesticides or poor nutrition can really make a difference in the outcome of these kind of infections. It can be, you know, turn something that would be mild symptoms into a lethal situation if they're stressed from these other factors like pesticides and starvation or poor nutrition. And while honeybees have gathered, you know, they've gotten a lot of attention in the media and in the science world because of colony collapse disorder. Most of the attention and most of the studies on bee diseases is really focused on the honeybee pathogens, but they are, you know, some of them are applicable to our native bees as well, and I'll let you know if that's the case. So we're going to start with the viruses. There's about 20 viruses are known to affect honeybees. The transmission occurs through interaction with other infected nestmates or with contaminated food. There can also be what they call vertical transmission, which is the queen might get it when she's mating from the drone, or she could get it, pass it on to her eggs when she's laying eggs. We can also see viral transmission happening from parasites and different hive pests, which can act as vectors for these virus transmissions. The picture here I have is something called the deformed wing virus. And obviously the name says it all, the bee is born with deformed wings, which really limits its ability to do a lot of jobs in the hive. For example, they use their wings to cure the honey. That's one way that they get it down to 16 or 17% reduction in water. The bees kind of use their wings to create heat over the winter for the queen. That's how they generate body heat, and also for foraging. I mean, if a bee has deformed wings like this, it can't go out on foraging trips. But anyway, the symptoms, as I said, of the infection really vary depending on the virus strain and the severity. Many honeybees viruses have been found to infect other species as well. Although limited research exists on the impact of honeybee viruses on wild bee populations, experimental evidence suggests that viruses can spill over as easily as being shared habitat spaces. So there can be honeybees leaving virus shed on flowers that then a native bee visits and can be infected. One of the things you'll hear spoken about a lot with honeybee and beekeepers is something called varroa mites. And varroa mites are known as Varroa destructor. That's their scientific name. They represent a significant threat to honeybee colonies. There was some recent research by a young guy named Samuel Ramsey, who was a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And up until his discovery, most scientists and people believe that these varroa mites would basically feed on the hemolymph of a bee, and the hemolymph is basically their blood. But Ramsey's experiments proved that, in fact, the varroa mites are feeding on the vitellogelin, which is a protein found in the fat bodies of bees rather than on the hemolymph. So fat bodies exist in all insects, and what they are is an energy storage center. So when food sources are good, they will accumulate lipids, glycogen, triglycerides, and proteins when food's abundant. And then the vitellogelin basically is the glycolipoprotein that plays a crucial role in this energy storage process. So when bees are living their longest life and overwintering, they tend to build up their fat bodies. And so this is when varroa mites really can feast on the vitellogelin, or the glycolipoprotein. And that basically is a whole meal. If you think about it, it's got, glycogen, it's got, protein, it's got triglycerides. It's like the full meal for the varroa mites. And so what they found is that beekeepers would see that colonies typically crashed in the late fall or winter. And that was because that's when the fat bodies on bees were most necessary for survival. For that long 45-week survival, they needed to have these fat bodies to live on. So by understanding the role of the varroa mite infestation with other bee diseases, scientists are trying to still figure out what causes colony collapse. There's definitely not one specific thing, but they think it's a combination of factors, and they've identified varroa mites as a big part of that. Zombie bees are a particular phenomenon that was discovered here in San Francisco Bay Area. An entomologist at San Francisco State started noticing these kind of dizzy bees on the San Francisco State campus. And so he started collecting them, and he would bring them home for his praying mantis, and they would, feed on these bees. But one weekend, little vial of disease on his desk to bring it home. And when he came in the next week, he found the bees were all dead in the vial, and it was full of little brown fly larvae. And so they discovered that this larva were the larva of a fly called the Apococephalus borealis. And what the Apococephalus borealis female does is she inserts her ovipositor into the abdomen of the bee, a honeybee, and she lays her eggs. So then the honeybee becomes the host for these eggs. And as they become larvae, they will come out of the bee and start devouring its wing muscles. And then they'll emerge as pupa out of the soft area between the head and the neck of the bee. But bees kind of know something's wrong when this is happening, and they have something called social immunity. And social immunity is when bees know there's something wrong, they'll leave their hive rather than cause potential infection to other bees. And so if you have a beehive here in the Bay Area and you've ever noticed you come home at 10 o'clock at night and you have bees kind of circling around the light in your doorway or something like that, typically by dark, bees would be back in the hive. So if they're out flying at night, there's something wrong. They could be zombie bees, or they could have some other disease. And so they're just trying to stay away from their hive, but stay warm. So bacterial infections that affect honeybees, the two primary ones are European and American foul brood. These diseases cause the larval sacs to degrade into a kind of sticky brown substance that will turn solid and then cast off spores. It's hard to, I mean, this is a devastating one. There is not a lot of scientific evidence about what other bacterial infections affect adult worker bees. But as I said, this might be underestimated due to the social immunity. So when a bee knows something's wrong with it, it tends to leave the hive so as not to threaten the rest of the community. But there is a Serratia marcescens, which is an opportunistic pathogen that has been found in the guts of dead honeybee workers. It's also been detected in varroa mites and in the hemolymph, or the blood of dead bees. So this bacterium can induce a fatal septicemia in adult bees and also potentially affect the brood as well. So that Serratia marcescens belongs to the Spiroplasma genus. And the Spiroplasma genus have been identified as threats to bumblebees, mason bees, as well as honeybees. So there is a potential crossover there. So fungal pathogens are obviously a big concern with bee nests, both above and below ground and in hives, because they're warm, humid environments, which is perfect for fungus. Chalk brood is probably the most famous fungal disease affecting the larvae of honeybees. It leads to their death, and then they are enveloped in a white kind of fungal growth. As some solitary cavity nesting bee species, like the mason bee, the leaf cutting bee, are also susceptible to chalk brood, just like the honeybees. Another fungal family is Microsporidia, and one of the Microsporidia causes Nosema serenae, which is basically best described as bee dysentery. If you have a beehive and you see yellow splotches by the entrance like that, that means there's some Nosema serenae happening in your hive. It's, again, transmitted through spores, like a lot of funguses are, and it causes intestinal infections in bees. It affects not only European honeybees, but also is a threat to various native bee species in North America, especially the honeybees. So pesticides, I'm really going to talk mostly about one because I have a lot to say about it, but neonicotinoids is a class of pesticide that's widely used around the world. and it has been facing some scrutiny due to the detrimental effect it's had on pollinators, particularly bees. And it has been banned in Europe, and it's being phased out in Canada. But these chemicals remain prevalent in the United States, with 47 products still available on the market. The EPA has banned some formulations in May 2019, but really it's the states that are stepping up. States like Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Jersey, California, Nevada, and Maryland have restricted neonicotinoid sales in retail stores, but they still do allow professionals to use neonicotinoids. Maine is the only state that's enforced a complete ban on neonicotinoids, so it can't be sold in stores and professionals can't use it. And New York just recently passed the first, but perhaps many will follow, a ban on neonicotinoid treated seeds for corn, soy, and wheat, although they do have some exceptions. Now, I don't know if you know a lot about neonicotinoids, but they're called a systemic pesticide. So you just need to treat a seed or a plant once with neonicotinoids, and then everything that grows thereafter will have neonicotinoids in it. So, for example, if you put in a seedling that's been treated with neonicotinoids, the flowers, all the branches and leaves that grow after that will have neonicotinoids in it. And in fact, they've found that neonicotinoids not only go into the plant, but it also goes into the ground. So you can put a plant that's been treated with neonicotinoids in the ground, and you might realize and be like, oh my gosh, what have I done? You pull it out, plant another plant there. Well, it'll probably most likely also have neonicotinoids in it as well. So they're pretty, as you can see from a chemistry standpoint, they're great at doing their job of being pesticides, but you only need to treat once and you're good for life, but they're really terrible for pollinators. And they were passed in the first place because they have what are considered sublethal effects. So they didn't like just kill bees outright, but they did have a lot of effects that have proved to be contributory to their short lives or deaths. Some retailers, most retailers now, like Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, True Value, have responded to public concerns, and they are phasing out the neonic use in their nursery trade. I don't know, remember just a few years ago, if you went to like a Home Depot, they would have a happy smiley flower symbol and they say, I've been treated with neonicotinoids. But anyway, that's all being phased out, which is really great. But it's still, still being used agriculturally and commercially. And it poses significant risks to honeybees and to bumblebees. Residues of these pesticides have been detected in pollen and in the nectar consumed by various pollinators. And it raises concerns about, what happens to the nervous system function and how does it affect the immunities in these bees. Scientific studies have highlighted the adverse impacts of neonicotinoids on bee populations. A really seminal study that was done in the UK for 18 years revealed that 20% decline in about the 62 different species of solitary native bees, all of whom were visiting fields of rapeseed in the UK. And I didn't know this, but rapeseed is what they make canola oil out of. Research also suggests that neonic exposure may increase the susceptibility of bees to certain pathogens and parasites, such as Nosemia cerene, the bee dysentery that we were just talking about. And this is really, really concerning that neonicotinoids are now in children and in you and I. They did a study on honey samples worldwide. And in the United States, Swiss researchers found that 86% of our honey has neonicotinoids in it. Here in California, they did a study down at UC Riverside, which reported 90% of the bees exposed to neonicotinoids experience reproductive difficulties. And this they consider it a water-soluble pesticide, but they had 90% of the bees had reproductive difficulties, irrespective of the amount of irrigation used. Studies have linked neonicotinoid exposure to abnormalities in bees, including impaired brain growth in young bumblebees, reduced sperm viability in male drones. It's just terrible. It's just terrible all the way around. So glyphosate, it's probably, as you know, the main ingredient of Roundup, but it's also used in a bunch of other herbicides. And it has come under scrutiny also for its potential impact on bee populations. The University of Texas in Austin studied glyphosate exposure, and they see that it might disrupt the gut bacteria or the gut flora of bees. And by disrupting this gut flora and fauna, it affects their immunity and makes them more susceptible to infection and death from harmful bacteria. They found that with exposure to glyphosate, they had lower survival rates to bacterial infections than if they were just exposed to the bacterial infection alone. And just a note to yourself, human gut bacteria or flora is very similar to bee gut bacteria and flora. So no doubt, I don't know if there's a study coming up, but glyphosate is probably affecting our own gut bacteria. So I want to talk a little bit about corporate farming, because it is a monoculture and it has caused a lot of habitat loss. You know, it's all over the world. There's a prevalence for monoculture farming. And this replaces grasslands, which are really important for wildflowers, which are important for native bee survival. Native bees live in a lot of grassland habitats, and just as a point of reference, 97% of Europe's grassland habitats have disappeared since World War II. And the Dutch did a study on female native bees, big-bodied bees, and they found that since World War II, there's not only been a population decline in their wild bee populations in the Netherlands, but the bees are also shrinking and getting smaller. And what's interesting about that is in that same period, Dutch people have been growing taller. So I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, that monocultures and the practice of growing single crops over large areas is reducing wildflower populations for native bees, and that this loss of habitat is definitely affecting their populations. So the fragmentation of bee habitats is not only due to farming, but it's, like I said, posing significant challenges for bee populations. Bees rely on flowers for their sustenance, with the nectar providing the carbohydrates and the pollen serving as the vital protein source. And landscapes devoid of flowering plants, such as meticulously manicured lawns, extensively paved urban areas, rural areas of monoculture farming, offer limited nutritional value to bees. This leads to malnutrition and a weakened immune system, and see these nutritionally compromised bees are just becoming more susceptible to the diseases and pesticides that they're being exposed to. Climate change is another formidable challenge for bees, particularly in the temperate zones where bee diversity is highest. So North America, Europe, that's where we have the most species of bees. Our frequent heat waves have been observed to drive local extinctions. They've reduced colonization rates. They've diminished the diversity of bees across North America and Europe. And these effects occur independently of the land use changes that we were just talking about. There's a direct impact of climate warming on bee populations. And lastly, I want to talk about resource competition. While it's clear that honeybees play a vital role in agriculture, we all know that they travel around with the hives to increase the crop yields. Their presence can be disruptive to the natural ecosystems by outcompeting the native bee species, many of which are already endangered. The rise of hobby beekeeping, which came, and I'm guilty too, came out of a really good intentioned will to help the bees, save the bees, has inadvertently exacerbated the problem for native bees. And studies are now showing this. Honeybees get a lot of media attention compared to native pollinators. And so their conservation efforts are like first and foremost in our mind. But high densities of honeybee colonies, and they're wildly successful generalist pollinators. So they can pollinate a lot of different kinds of plants. And this really intensifies the competition for the floral resources of pollen and nectar for the native bee species. Another interesting finding is that honeybees, they're so good at pollinating that they're contributing to the pollinating certain weedy invasive species, which are, of course, disrupting our native plant communities and helping spread invasives by helping them produce seeds. All right, I'm available for questions. I see one person in the chat, and I hope it's not someone. Oh, pollen and nectar. So Stephen Fisher had a question of what's the difference between
No,
pollen.
I'm gonna lay down in my bed. Thank you.
So I think maybe, Stephen, that I answered that question, hopefully in the discussion. And I'm going to stop my screen sharing now if I can find my cursor. There we go. And I will turn it back over to the class if you have any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for James?
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Okay.
It sounded as though it's a question about inbreeding, that it sounded as though the bees were kind of self sharing with each other, and in humans and a lot of animals that causes inbreeding. Is that the case in bees, or is there some defense against the tendencies to for disease and things as a result of that? Am I reading? How should I read inbreeding?
Well, that's a really good question, Catherine. And indeed, there is a lot of inbreeding. It's possible that both in native populations and honeybees that the queen will mate with a drone male from a different nest, but often they do mate with the same nest. I don't know that there's any studies about inbreeding. I think because it's just how they do it. I don't think I've ever seen a study about that, but it's a really good question. I would think that since bees have been around so long, that if the inbreeding were the issue, we would have seen problems with their health and population numbers before modern man kind of added all these chemical additives to the equation. But it's a great question. I'm gonna look and see if anybody's ever talked about that. Thank you for that question.
James, we're seeing your there we go.
When the screen's up, you can't find your cursor.
It looks like we have some more questions in the chat. I just wanted you to have some what's the word, security. Or not having everyone know what you're interested in. Wasp yellow jackets, contribution to earth-friendly gardening?
Yes, they do. Wasps, in fact, are the main pollinators for some fig species. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different pollinators. I think the reason people focus on bees, again, is because they're responsible for 80% of the pollination, but hummingbirds pollinate. There's a lot of pollinators out there. So, you know, welcome all of them to your garden. And again, pesticides are probably just as bad for wasps as they are for bees.
How about yellow jackets, James? I know from Marin County, they send people to exterminate them and kill the nests, but is that something we should be doing?
You know, I think that's a personal choice. Unfortunately, they are much more aggressive than bees are. And I remember when I used to do this this talk at different libraries and at the fair, I would always have this big line of people after the talk to ask me about these bees that were attacking them when they were out having picnics and stuff. And I had to always tell people that what they called in California, they call them meat bees. They aren't bees at all. They are in fact yellow jacket wasps. And that bees are really mostly interested in pollen and nectar. So they're not going to come to your picnic to land on your meat or do anything like that. And also they won't be aggressive with you unless they get tangled in your hair or you cross paths and they get scared. Whereas wasps will go after you. So, I mean, personally, I struggle with them because they do attack my one remaining beehive. And so I do try to keep an eye out for where their nests are and do what I can to kind of, you know, have them move along. But I think it's a personal choice because they are also pollinators.
And let's see, if you keep honeybees, wait,
Layla, I see Layla's question, and that's exactly what I do. I once had 3 hives, and I really, after I learned about how much they were out competing native bees and contributing to their stress, I really thought, okay, when these hives go away, I'm just not going to replace them. And I was down to 1, and last winter it didn't make it through the winter. And I thought, okay, I'm going to be done. But it was, you know, I left the hive out just basically to deal with it in the spring. And sure enough, a new hive moved in, a new swarm moved in. So I do have bees again, but I don't take honey from them. And I think that once they've kind of built up enough stores, they get a little bit lazy and they won't go out and compete as much. So I think that's a really good strategy because I love watching the bees. And I love the fact that my garden looks so amazing because of the bees. But I think leaving the honey is a really good way for a home beekeeper to, you know, maybe keep them from out competing the native bees. Barbara's question is, what can I do to help the native bee population? Barbara, I would suggest going to the Urban Bee Lab site. They will tell you some plants there that are very, very great for, you know, long blooms that help the bumblebees. But as we kind of discussed from my talk, that a lot of bumblebees are, of course, native bees, and those native bees are really attracted to native plants. So I think putting native plants in your garden is kind of essential and key to the native. And if you can put in more than just one specimen plant, but put it in a large patch, that'd be a big help to the native bee population. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when I moved to California, Bombus occidentalis was one of the most prevalent bumblebees there were, the Western bumblebee. And it's now almost completely endangered. So just in my, 20 years of living I've lived here for 26 years, but didn't know much about bees before that. But just in that past couple decades, one of the most populous bumblebees in the state have now reached crisis.
Thank you, James. And you had also mentioned, I guess, with the bumblebees as well, to have large patches
yes.
of pollinating flowering plants. And you
yes.
said between 15 to 20 different species.
15 to 20 different flowering varieties, yes. If you want pollinators in your garden, you have to basically have stuff for them to like remember to always go there because there's always something in bloom. And they'll learn that and they'll come back. I mean, I sadly lost a grevillea tree, which was huge, and the hummingbirds loved it, and it just died. I don't know what happened to it, but they still come back. It's only been a couple months, but they're still coming back looking for it every day. So I think pollinators remember where they can find the floral resources they're looking for. So if you have a lot of varieties blooming in your garden, they'll come.
Thank you. Highly informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are
All
there
right,
any
well-
more questions? You can unmute yourself. I think that's it, James.
Well, thank you all for your time and attention, and congratulations on getting close to the end of the class. I look forward to meeting you all. Come by and say hi at the job fair, and I'd love to tell you about the progress I'm working on. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much. That
James.
was great.
Thank you. Okay, I think now we're running about a half hour early, so let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 25 to 11.
Both.
Thank you.
I think this next session is going to be very dry and boring. It's the things about the volunteer management system, which I've been working with for
Hi,
years, and we've already
somebody's
talked
not
about it
on,
3 times.
on
Yeah,
mute that probably
someone's
wants to
not.
be.
Please be sure to mute yourself. Okay, Patrick, would you like to begin?
I'm happy to do so. Unless there's somebody else who would like to volunteer.
Sorry, I said I would get Diddy.
As Ethan eloquently stated, we are going to be covering certification in VMS. I'm going to send out a PDF with all of this explained a little bit later on today, but just wanted to go over this. When we first presented this was week 2, so we understand that there was a lot of information that you've been presented. I feel like you have a better understanding of the structure of the organization and feel a lot more comfortable. I've seen a lot of people who've been signing up for volunteer opportunities and for continuing education in VMS. Like I see, it's exciting to see training names. If you feel comfortable with it, feel free to just follow along. If you want more help, this could be a good opportunity for you to ask for help. Just a reminder, once you pass the exam, or once you get your exam score back, you're officially certified as a master gardener. And that means you're officially certified to discuss home gardening information. We don't want people who are untrained or uncertified to go out and speak for the organization. So we require certification in order to actually engage with the public and share home gardening information. So that's what certification means. And certification is actually an annual process. You do have to annually complete certification to remain a master gardener. Once you pass this exam, you're a certified master gardener, but you have to continue to volunteer in order to stay and do continuing education in order to stay a master gardener. And if you don't do those, you're no longer able to claim that you're a master gardener. So next year in VMS, you're going to be labeled a first-year Master Gardener. It's just a differentiating term. It doesn't really mean anything. There's nothing special. It's just labeled. It's just a different label. Now, for accruing hours, if you start volunteering in projects, you're able to start accruing those hours now. So some of you have signed up for the tomato market. I've seen a couple other projects that people have signed up for. If you want to sign up for them now, if you want to wait, I'm sure it's a lot of work going on right now, both with your GPP and then your final exam coming. So if you want to wait, that's not a problem. You'll have plenty of opportunity. You have like over a year to get them. But just a heads up that you can accrue them now. Continuing education, because you're in the middle of your education process, those don't actually accrue until you actually pass the exam. So you're able to start earning continuing education hours after you pass the exam. There was some recent changes to the continuing education accumulation hours. I could share more information about that in the email later on today. But basically, it kind of, some people were getting them all via YouTube or going to external conferences, and just provided a little bit more guidelines about where you can actually get those continuing education hours from, just to provide a little bit of structure to that. And then by next year, by next June, in order to remain a Master Gardener, you have to attain 12 hours of continuing education and 50 volunteer hours. In the future, that 50 is cut down to 25. 50 is just for your first year, and ongoing is 25 hours each year. You still have to do the 12 hours of continuing education, but 50 hours is just in the first year. Any questions about the certification requirements? All right. Breaking down the 50 hours in your first year, there's a couple hours, and I'll start actually at the bottom and then go up. One of those shifts has to be a farmer's market shift. There are 2 farmer's markets, and we're going to show you that slide in just a second. You can do the farmer's market shift either in San Rafael at the Sunday farmer's market or at the Saturday farmer's market in Point Reyes. Some people have feel more comfortable with the smaller farmers market. The Sunday one is really big. You're going to see most of your neighbors. You're going to see a lot of people. So if you prefer a quieter, don't really want to see that many people, or just want a quieter event, the Point Reyes one is a better option, perhaps. But the opportunities are a bit more limited with the Point Reyes. It doesn't happen every week. In addition to that one shift, you have to have 4 hours at 3 separate projects. You can't spend all of your time just focused on one entire project for your first year. We do ask you to see a couple different projects and get a better understanding of what other projects are available. And those don't include farmers market and the farm day. So you do have to kind of look at other projects in addition to those. And then the remaining hours, the remaining 33 or 34, depending on how many hours you do at the farmer's market, can be at any project. You could spread those out across a number of different projects. You could go to Falkirk, you could do Eat It, Dig It, Grow It. You could do any project for 33, 34 hours. And these are just minimums. Like, a lot of people go well above this in their first and future years. But we just wanted to be able to make sure that people had an understanding of different projects in their first year, so they don't dive in completely into one and just kind of don't think about or don't really know about other parts of the organization. So that's what the breakdown is this way. I'm going to jump into signing up for volunteer opportunities, but let me quickly talk about the farmers market certificate, the farmers market requirement. The Marin Civic Center, this is the big San Rafael Marin Market. This is on Sundays from 8 to 1. The shift is only from 8:30 to 12:30 at the farmers market, because you do have to go pick up the materials. And that is not all year. This farmers market runs all year, but the actual Marin Master Gardener table is only from April to October. We don't do it in the winter. The Point Reyes station, that market only runs, I believe it's April through November. But we're there beginning in June, and we're there every other week. So if you want more information, those are listed. Both of these are listed in VMS, but we do ask that you select a shift after June 30th, just to allow my class to be able to sign up. I actually had not done my shift, so I'm going to do it in a couple of weeks, actually in a month. But make sure to sign up after June 30th, just to allow the remaining folks in my class to do a shift. But let's talk about VMS. And again, like, I've seen a lot of your names in there already, so if you feel comfortable with this, don't worry. This is just a reminder. For those people who want the help, this would be a quick walkthrough. Oh, shoot, I didn't want to sign in, sorry. Just a reminder, when we log in, if you don't remember how to get there, you can just do UCAN or VMS, and it should pop up with this, and then you want to log in with your information. I just wanted to provide the walkthrough for those folks who needed the extra support. If you feel comfortable, don't worry about it. Sorry, I didn't log out all the way, but this is the page you go to it after you enter in your password. You're going to click Marin County. I'm in VMS here. The easiest way to sign up for a volunteer opportunity is to go to calendars over here on the left in the green bar.
Patrick,
Yes.
we're still seeing your slideshow and not your computer
Oh,
screen.
my gosh. Thank you. All right, there we go.
There you go.
So after you put in your password, you go to UCAN or VMS. You're going to click Marin County, and it's going to bring you to this page. The easiest way to figure out where you want to go is to go to calendars, and this will list all the projects. This will list most of the projects and the events coming up. Sometimes they kind of overfill, so you might need to go to the week or the day view. But we have a pretty big event coming up that still needs volunteers. I saw an email just the other day asking for drivers. I'm actually signed up as a driver, the tomato transporters. If you have an SUV or you have a pickup truck, this is a great way to get some hours. It took maybe half an hour, and they give you a minimum of 2 hours, so it's a really easy job. It is early in the morning, but if you're okay with that, you can be a tomato transporter. Let me find one that doesn't have, so these are the loaders. So the greenhouse loaders or helpers, this is from 6:30 to 8:15. Again, they give you guaranteed hours. Most projects don't do guaranteed hours. Most projects say, you get the time that you're there. But because these opportunities are, this is like our most important fundraiser of the year. I think that's why they give you a minimum of hours, just because they want to make sure that people show up. So people who are short on hours have an opportunity to earn them by participating in an event like this. You're going to just click on volunteer. It'll add your name over here. So this is the first year Master Gardener. Again, it makes no practical difference. There's no real difference. It's just a way to distinguish between first year and Master Gardeners who've been here for a longer time. Any event that you sign up for, there's an upcoming event that frustratingly is not listed, but on May 15th, we're actually having a bee-themed annual party. It's not listed here, but the annual party is really our biggest event of the year and our biggest annual party of the year. It's where they award, if you've seen anybody with a gold or even like a silver or platinum badge, those are for people who have earned 1,000 hours or 2,500, even 5,000 or 7,500 hours. And then if you see the little trinkets, the little charms hanging from people's badges, those are also awarded there. They do a Volunteer of the Year award. It's a pretty nice event. They have food, they have beverages, and it's a good opportunity to see people from your class that you may not have seen for a couple weeks. It is in the evening at the Indian Valley campus. Before that, there's actually a demonstration garden, the edible demonstration garden. We'll be doing tours. They talk about it in row by row, which you should have received a couple weeks ago. And it should be listed on here shortly. I'm not sure why it's not. If you don't really want to go to the event, but you want to volunteer for the event, they need people to set up. They need people to break down. So if you're okay lifting chairs or helping with tables, it's a great way to get some hours and meet some new people. And it's a fun event if you want to go. Also, the edible demonstration garden, if you haven't been up there, is really awesome. And things are starting to come in up there. So it's a great time of year to visit there. But that's on May 15th. It should be up here soon. Just click on it and that's how you register. One note that I should say is no matter if it's a social event or a continuing education, they always say volunteer. So even if you're not actually volunteering, if you're going there if you're going on a hike or you're doing something else, it's always called volunteer. So just don't be turned off by the volunteer. It's just a general button that we click for any sort of activity. Any questions about the signing up for events?
Patrick, I don't have a question specifically about signing up for events. I've done that, but I do have a question. I went on the wildflower hike, And I was the recorder, and afterwards I did a PowerPoint presentation with all the photos that I took and put the names on them. And what does that qualify as any volunteering hours, or is that just like an extra thing? Because I obviously can't at this point get the CE credit for doing that hike.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
That's a good question. I would actually email the coordinator of that hike and explain it. I mean, it should count. Like we don't want you to do work like that you're not actually being counted for. So if you want to actually contact let's see,
I got her. I'll call Katie Martin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would just say what you did and say, like, I did this many hours. Is it okay if I track it? If you don't know who the actual coordinator is, you can just email the actual teams down here. And this goes to a contact at each team. So they should be able to tell you, or for each event, there's like an actual contact person listed. This is a much more general, like, hey, do we get hours for this sort of thing?
Okay.
I can't imagine you wouldn't get hours for that if it was like an official thing, but yeah, you wouldn't get the continuing education hours now. Thank you.
Right. I understand. So I shouldn't log those in, obviously. Okay. Or do I log them in, but not, do I?
I would connect with the coordinator and just say like, hey, this is what I'm going to enter in for volunteer hours. I'd be more like, this is what I'm going to do. Is that okay? And just like verify it with them to make sure it's okay.
Okay. Thank you so
But yeah,
much.
you can enter in the volunteer hours. How was the hike? Was it good?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I felt like we didn't have as many things happening yet as probably will be on this next one.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was beautiful, beautiful day.
Good. Another clarification that I want to point out around the continuing education and the volunteer hours. Again, you can start earning volunteer hours now. Continuing education is allowed after you pass the final exam. There's a little bit of there's more clarity now than there has been in the past. As I talked about, they recently kind of revamped the process and the bylaws around earning and generating these hours. And so some of the guilds, if you're interested in joining one of the guilds, they'll be talking about this more in detail at the project fair, or this is a good thing to ask them at the project fair. But some of the guilds, you're going to earn continuing education hours versus volunteer hours. So using my example on the pruning guild, the pruning guild is like it's a teach the trainers sort of program. So the first year, I'm just learning how to prune. Like I'm learning the pruning, I'm learning different trees, I'm learning the process. Your second year is more learning like how to teach, but you're also learning the process. By the third year, you're training the first years. And so in my first year, all of my time in the pruning guild is continuing education. Like I'm learning the whole time. In my second year, it's going to be more like half and half, where I'm going to be doing volunteer, teaching the new people, as well as doing learning by, I'll have a third year teaching me what to do. And everybody will learn continuing education at some point because we have an expert coming from outside, coming and teaching us, even the third years. And so it kind of changes over time, the balance of continuing education and volunteer. By my third year, my hours there will be just about all volunteer and just a little bit of continuing education. You need a lot more volunteer hours and continuing education hours. So that is something to be mindful of if you are interested in doing the pruning guild or one of the other guilds, that they don't always qualify for volunteer hours. So they'll talk about that more in depth at the informational meetings or at the project fair, but it is something just to be aware of if your time is pretty limited. Okay. Any questions about volunteer hours or conducting? All right. Unfortunately, Cinda is not here today, so we are going to be talking through the projects. All right. All right. Our first one, actually, I feel like everybody's familiar with. New member training. This is what we're doing right now. I believe there are some people who are interested in supporting this next year. That's very exciting. But if you're interested in supporting this new member training next year, Melissa is the best person to speak to it. And Melissa, I'm going to turn the rest over to you.
There are many areas of opportunity where you can help with new member training. Then we have the mentor that's okay.
Sorry.
We have the mentor program, which you are pretty much familiar with. You've been contacted by your mentors. The mentors are not TAs. I think we went over that at the beginning. The mentors are there pretty much once you are certified to kind of guide you through our organization, because the organization is huge. And they during your training here, the mentors are also guiding you through our organization, so you're more familiar with that. Right now, it's Jeanette Perez, but next year it'll be Cinda Valles, who will be the mentor leader. And if you would like to be a mentor, you should contact Cinda. And the next slide, Patrick. The board leadership. The board helps manage all MMG programs, providing oversight and support. There are monthly board meetings, which occur the second Thursday of the month. And pretty much, you can be recruited by board members. Our organization is listed right underneath the former board member, but you see Bonnie there, and you see Marie there. And as Joan said, she started out just like you and became a co-president. And if you look at row by row, every row by row issue at the bottom of row by row has our organization, and you can check it out. And there is usually a recruitment call. That's how Carol and I got to be trainers the year before. So I think, is that all three of
Yep.
the projects? Okie dokie. So we can go. And obviously, how today's topic fits with EFG, it's, to me, it's so obvious, especially the way we can attract bees. But just keeping and reduce the use of pesticides, because it can be harmful to bees. So we're going to move on for the housekeeping final exam. The test question number 35.
Melissa, I can, yeah.
Would you take care of that?
Do you want to
Thank
talk about
you.
next Thursday? Sorry. The study session first?
Yeah, what we're going to do is next Thursday, we are going to have the bug lady. Sorry to keep on referring to her as that, but she refers to herself as that. Afterwards, I will hang, if you and your study group want to meet for the final, I will hang out at Hamilton and you can meet in small groups. If you want to go back home and finish your final there, that's going to be up to you. It is totally going to be your decision on what you do after the presentation. Go ahead, Patrick.
Question 35, if you've gotten to this one on the test, that's great. I've gotten a couple of emails and I just wanted to provide a little clarification. This was my mistake. If you have the unlocked version, feel free to change it for yourself. If you don't, the correct words are actually in the question. The question asked, was the difference between seed scarification and seed stratification? I copied and pasted the two things wrong, and I put soil texture and soil structure. It should read scarification and stratification. If you have the luck version, just go ahead and answer the correct word with scarification first and stratification second. If you have the unlocked version, feel free to change it yourself. But that was my mistake, and thank you for the folks who reached out flagging that. Sorry, this was a quick project and I did not catch that. Question 50, oops, sorry. Question 50, just want to clarify that there's no real wrong answers here. We just want you to think critically, but there's no right or wrong answer. It's really just how's your experience? What do you think we could do better as an organization, which I think everybody should be thinking about critically for organizations that they're a part of. And then finally, the name issue. I've looked at a couple solutions and we're going to provide two options. One, if you really just don't want to mess with it, you can just handwrite your name on each page. That's the easiest, simplest way if you don't want to stress about this. And then I'm going to email out directions for you to unlock and put your name at the top of each page if you feel like you want it all typed. So it got a little bit complicated, and sorry if I made it more complicated, but I was trying to get them all to look consistent, and that was not actually possible. So if you don't really want to mess with it, feel free to just print it out and type your name, but just write your name at the top. If you want it to all look a little bit more consistent, I will email out directions for how to undo the restrictions and add in your name. Any questions about the exam before I jump on?
Patrick, so the unlocked version that you sent out, aren't we able to add our names to that?
Correct. Sorry. Yeah, this is just for the locked version. Yep.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Yep. If you chose the unlocked version, you can add your name anywhere. Well, at the top, probably. All right, another mistake on my part. Last night I sent out a survey asking for corrections to your name. I did not realize that these badges had to be printed ASAP. So if you could, today after class, we're going to get out quite early today. If you're not happy with the name listed here or you want any changes to it, please make sure, please click on the link today because tonight, we're going to send in the final list of names for printing on the badges. We're assuming everybody's going to pass the test, and we're going to have your name badges printed. So my mistake, I didn't realize the due date, and we do need this a lot sooner than the 18th, as I originally indicated. If you have a green check, we already received your response. If you're happy with your name here, you do not need to do anything. But if you see any changes that you'd like with your name or your spelling or hyphenation, anything, just fill out that quick little link that I sent last night. Questions?
I think, Charles, you've checked off and you have stated that I haven't gone to the website. Did you put down Chuck or are you happy with Charles?
Yes, it's Chuck.
Okay, and is Antonella on there? Okay.
Yep, yeah, if there's a green check, they're all done. They've already done it.
Okay.
So those are the people that don't need to do anything. But if you're happy here, if you're good with your name, you do not need to do anything. But again, please click it tonight if you are if you want any changes.
Yes, I signed in. I changed me to Chuck, and it worked out quite easily.
Good.
Thank you. All right. Do you want to go through graduation?
Yeah, I will go through graduation. As Patrick said, you should have received a link. And you did put a deadline on it. I don't have it in front of me and what was the deadline? Can you remind us all of that, Patrick?
The trainees are next Friday. And then the external, well, the other members are the week after.
Okay. So in the survey, what you're going to do is sign up whether you want a vegetarian or a turkey sandwich. The menu is going to be those two items. There will be salad and there will be chips. If you do want to bring your own wine, there will be, or beer or that, there will be alcohol allowed, but you will need to bring your own glasses, and it will have another table set up there. Wine and beer, as it's stated here, is totally optional. You don't have to bring it. I think I've already discussed the event theme, a little correct and program. There is going to be a good number of people there. We're inviting the TAs, the board, the mentors. So it'll be a lot of people there helping you celebrate getting your official badge and at that time your certificate. As you see, the trainees' responsibilities, and just as an aside, it says here the setup time is 9:30. When I went to visit Homeward Bound, they said they would be open at 8:30. So if you need that extra time, please know that it is available. There will be, as I've spoken to some of the members who are doing this, there will be audio, video, etc. So whatever you decide to do for your graduation, you will have access to all technical availability. Is there any questions about graduation?
Yeah, Melissa, are
Okay.
there tablecloths for the tables?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
I've gotten light blue tablecloths, and they offer only 2 colors in napkins, and the white looked kind of weird on the light blue, so we're going with black like we did at the orientation.
Perfect.
By the way, you just reminded me, the cookies will be on your table, so if you're decorating the table, because we felt you'll be doing presenting, we'll be giving out the badges and your certificate, that it would be so much better if we had the cookies on the table so people were not getting up and leaving as all this was going on. Okay, I think we can move on.
Just one other thing. Sorry. We are collecting pictures for the graduation PowerPoint. So Melissa will be sending out, it's another Google form. If you have any pictures that you've taken during class, please just upload them to that file, because we're going to have kind of like a running slideshow just when people are walking in, just so people could see what went on in the class. So if you have any good photos, please upload them there.
Thank you, Patrick. Also, I wanted to know, are there flowers or anything on the tables, and how many tables are there?
I think Joanna and Linda.
Julie, I have all this information. Was that Linda?
Julie, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Joanna and I have all the information on the number of tables, and have also had some discussion on centerpieces. So we'll share that offline.
Okay, thank you, Julie.
All right.
I apologize, Julie. Any other questions?
I just want to ask if this is an actual picture of the setup for the graduation, or is just a mock picture?
This is just, yeah, there's no table 10, there's nothing,
Okay.
no
Yep.
thing like that.
Yep, no problem.
If you look at last week's PowerPoint, that was an actual picture from last year. I think it was on the centerpieces were all student made just from people's gardens. But I'm pretty sure there was one from actual graduation last year, or I can send you some if you'd like to see ideas.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, coming up, class 16, April 18th, we're meeting in person at Hamilton, and it's going to be insects. This has been a favorite of previous classes, so I hope everyone will be able to make it. Also, you will have a chance to, as I said, either meet with your study group or go home and finish your final if you haven't already. If you have, it's just going to be free time for you after insects. And if you're going to have your study group there, my recommendation would be that one of you brings books. I mean, carrying all the books are really kind of daunting. And the final for class 17 on April 25th, we'll have the annual project fair in the morning. We'll gather at Hamilton Community Center at 9:30, along with other recent MMG graduates, to learn about many projects that you can sign up for or volunteer. Then you'll have a lunch break. We'll have a class photo, and you will be handing in your final. There will be Janice Rosales will be there to greet you, and she will have a box that is exactly like your GPP box, and you will be depositing your finals there. I really believe that everyone will be passing their final, so I will recommend that you keep May 2nd open because it should be a lot of fun. So are there any questions before Patrick and I disappear? Okie doke. I don't know if I sign off. Oh, closing the garden gate. Patrick, would you answer this question for me? If I sign off, is that going to cancel the Zoom? Should I just
I was
leave
just
the
going to
area?
ask that. Yeah.
This is Joe. Julie and I are both, Patrick put us both on as co-presenters so that people won't drop off.
Yep. Okay.
We can drop off, they can continue and close the meeting. We're going to stop the recording though.
Okay, perfect. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? You guys have a good week, and thank you for coming today. I thought the bees presentation was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, the bees was amazing.
Okay, thank you, Julie.